Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Offensive propaganda or new propaganda offensives. At the start of this year, the Obama administration announced new online initiatives to bolster its foreign policy narratives, as well as a means to counter others. For example, this network, RT. Maybe a better course of action would be for the U.S. State Department to ask itself why fewer and fewer people trust and believe it. To Crosstalk Propaganda, I'm joined by my guest, James Cardin in Washington. He's a contributor to The Nation as well as the editorial director for the American Committee for East-West Accord. In New York, we have Don DeBar. He's an anti-war activist and host of a daily radio program. And here in Moscow, we cross to Mark Sloboda. He's an international affairs and security analyst. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. James, if I go to you first in Washington, D.C., a few days ago, you wrote an article for The Nation titled Uncle Sam got a shiny new propaganda bullhorn for Christmas. Bullhorn, I think, has something to do with where I work right now. Why do they need these new propaganda initiatives here? I mean, I would assume that people aren't believing what they have to say. Why do you need to have a new initiative? Go ahead.
They don't need to. That's the problem. I'm not really sure what the point of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is anymore. The Cold War ended in and around 1991 when the Soviet Union dissolved. So having Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty makes about as much sense as NATO. These things seem to be self-perpetrating institutions and frankly a waste of taxpayer money. So my concern is that Congress and the institution of Radio Free Europe has been fooled and scared into funding a new outlet, and this outlet is, of course, the Interpreter online magazine.
Okay. You know, Mark, can you give us a little bit of background on the Interpreter, its owner, and its political agenda? Go ahead, Mark.
Oh, yeah. The Interpreter is effectively a subset of the Institute for Modern Russia, a very credible-sounding organization, except that it is 100% funded and owned by the criminal oligarch Khodorkovsky, who is now living in self-exile in the West and has openly spoken of the need to overthrow the Russian government and essentially dissolve the Russian people and elect another more Western populace in its place. The Interpreter is one of the most noxious Russophobic blogs. It's a little more than a glorified blog out there. Okay. And it's staffed mostly by U.S. rabid neocons like Michael Weiss.
Okay, Mark, just one more step further. What is the connection between Radio Free Europe and the Interpreter, as we heard from James here? They have a new relationship, correct?
Yes, they are now effectively merging. You will have shows from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, such as Brian Whitmore's Russophobic, no matter how much he protests otherwise, blog, The Power Vertical, on the Interpreter, and you will have regular broadcasts from the Interpreter, a source run and funded by a criminal Russian oligarch on U.S. taxpayer-funded state propaganda, and it's really an amazing development. We know that you know, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty had a funding relationship with the CIA all the way up into 1972, but they haven't been quite as egregious a vector for propaganda, particularly targeting Russia, since then, as they are now once again becoming.
You know, Don, I just fail to understand what the true mission here, other than just to smear Russia and to make sure the U.S. and Russia do not have a good relationship. There are areas where the two countries can work, but you know, when Radio Free Europe, it has a long history of having emigres from Eastern Europe, from Eastern European communist regimes. It isn't a Cold War relic here. It's trying to find a mission here, and this Interpreter outfit, well, they certainly have a very transparent agenda, and that is to smear anyone that says anything constructive about Russia, any truth about Russia, or any kind of objectivity about Russia. They're they're there to smear and to cow and to try to subvert any kind of normative narrative about politics here. This is very dangerous. And, you know, I wonder if the American taxpayer has any idea what kind of noxious people these are. Go ahead.
Well, there's a lot there. First, Radio Free Europe actually now has a much larger mission than just to smear the Russian leadership in front of the Russian people. Since last year, the prohibition against this taxpayer-funded entity propagandizing the American public with its own money, it was outlawed up until last year. They are now allowed to do that. And if you look through the American media, you'll see various articles, reports sourced from those entities, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and all of that. So a good part of the mission is now to propagandize the American people. Back when I was growing up during the Cold War, I'm 62 now, we saw on television, in movies, portrayal of Radio Free Europe and of the Soviet Union. In Soviet Union, people were, they were in black and white. They were wearing drab clothing, waiting online for dull gray packages. And here and there you would see a family huddled together near a radio, tuning in Radio Free Europe and getting the truth, and the rainbow would light up behind them and all of this. And this was going to save them. That and the Blessed Virgin Mary, I think we were taught in Catholic school. This is still in the back of the minds of people over 40 years old here. Yeah. So, you have a very, very distorted soil in which all of this stuff grows, very polluted soil. On the other hand, the merging of, basically the privatization of this with no less a Russian oligarch has a very different purpose. Number one, I'm guessing it's not only going to be an information center for, counter-government activity in Russia and around Russia, but also probably some sort of a financial sinkhole where money can be moved around to evade NGO regulations and all of that. So, I'd be watching, at all of those levels.
James, does the U.S. Congress know what they're getting in bed with here? I mean, when I read your article, I found it really quite remarkable because I know the history of Radio Free Europe quite well. Again, I'm a child of the Cold War, and I know what it did, and I can say there were some pluses and there were some minuses, but now they're just signing up, they're just selling themselves to this entity with a very clear biased negative agenda. And I have to wonder, do Congress know, or do they care?
They know all too well, because throughout 2015 they've held hearings featuring writers from The Interpreter and their friends. So you had Peter Pomerantsev appear before both the House and the Senate. You have the neoconservative scholar Leon Aaron, who's actually a member of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is the parent organization of Radio Free Europe. And Representatives Ed Royce and Elliot Engel have introduced legislation in effect trying to transform Radio Free Europe from a relatively staid news-gathering organization to a propaganda outlet. So the answer is yes, they do know.
Okay, well, if I go to Mark here, I mean, I'm looking at James's article, and, we have people like the Washington Post and Applebaum and other lesser lights. I like that comment. Thank you, James, here. Have been ceaselessly ringing the alarm over the civilizational threat posed by Russian state-funded media outlets like RT. I never thought we were part of a civilizational threat. Go ahead, Mark. Wow, you're an important guy.
Thanks. Being regarded as a threat to American civilization was something I always dreamed of as a child and when I served in the U.S. military. It's no surprise. I mean, when we see figures like Ann Applebaum, Michael Weiss, Ed Lucas, they're all connected in, these rabid neocons. And what we're seeing is the neocons have not only taken over U.S. foreign policy, continuing on from the Bush years into the Obama years without any interruption whatsoever, but they are now also in charge of American propaganda. And I don't think it should really surprise anyone. As early as 2000. 2010. The chief of the Broadcast Board of Governors, Walter Isaacson, said outright that RT, Press TV, Iranian Press TV, the Qatari Al Jazeera, China's CCTV, these are the enemies of the Broadcast Board of Governors, and that they are in an information war that they think they need to win. And the way to win that is to at once hire the most noxious, neocons who promote a militarist U.S. foreign policy, marriage with large sums of money, and now obviously with criminal oligarchs who also have large sums of money. So it all makes a kind of perfect sense. It's actually not a marriage of convenience, but a marriage of true love.
Okay, Don, essentially what is happening here is that they don't want to have any kind of democratic, fair discussion about topics that they declare taboo. So there'll be no talk, no discussion, no conversation, either our way or the highway. Go ahead, Don.
Well, first, I have to go back to your comment about them not being very discerning about who they get into bed with. That and who they take money from, actually, they are not very discerning at all to a person in the U.S. Congress. So I wouldn't use that metaphor because it's too absurd compared to what they actually do in their regular lives. That said, if you look at the, and it depends on where you're talking about this media war being fought, first of all. Are you fighting for the attention and or loyalty and or positioning in front of the American public, Western opinion, opinion inside Russia, inside the former Warsaw Pact countries, China? I understand there's a global struggle going on, but the form it takes and the tools that are available to them differ from market to market.
Okay, Don, hold that thought. We're going to have to go to a short break, gentlemen, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on propaganda. Stay with RT. Okay, Don, I want to go back to you and finish off with your point because I think it's really interesting here. One of the things I find interesting when there's commentary, congressional hearings, and it's talked about this network, RT, where I work, number one, they say it's a propaganda outlet, but I've never given any empirical evidence. They never cite an example of what they mean by that. In this Leon Aron that was mentioned here, again, I'm mystified. He wrote a very damaging article, the first half of it about RT, but he never gave one concrete example. My point is here is that we're actually a punching bag for everybody that wants to get money. If it's the BBC or CNN from its shareholders or from the U.S. government, everybody's looking for a nickel here, and they blame or say, this RT is a threat. No, it's because we're effective without having to have to propagandize, and they're looking for more cash inflow because none of them are communicating very clearly right now. One of the reasons why they come to this program and this network. Go ahead, Don.
Well, first, I guess we should be charging a commission for generating all that income. Well, the point I was making earlier, essentially, if you're looking at, say, the American market to see how this battle takes place, you have television and the internet are the two main electronic distribution media. RT is very big on the internet, the largest, I think, still English language news distributor on YouTube with more than 2 billion hits. Larger than all of the others, yeah, by far. You have, though, many people still watching television, and that is almost exclusively at this point cable television. And the way that that's distributed in the United States, you have usually maybe two providers in each marketplace in terms of actual cable. So I'm staying at my mother's house right now frequently because she's elderly and needs some help, and I'm staying at my own house too. And they're in two different cable markets, both in north of New York City. In one, there's the company Optimum and the company Verizon. And where my mother is, there's Verizon and Time Warner. Now, RT is not on Verizon or OptOnline. Al Jazeera America is not on any of them except for Verizon. And so there's already a filter in front of a large part of the viewing audience just based on whether the carrier decides to carry them or not. Now, Verizon, which is a large carrier, is carrying Al Jazeera America, and we learned in the process of that being shut down by its owners that at maximum it had 30,000 viewers. So, you know, the decision to place them was not based on viewership, but rather it was political, as I'm sure the decision to exclude RT from the cable systems that it's excluded from, which is most of them, is also a political decision. So you have that at the ground level in terms of what's offered in the media marketplace here. And there's a big break in age between elderly people, younger people, over where they get their news. People over 65 generally get it from television, and people under generally get it from the internet. There's one last thing, which is that on cable television, you have 300 or 400 channels. Perhaps 10 of them are news channels, and then you have maybe perhaps another 5 or 6 that are variety that have their own news department, CBS, NBC, ABC, etc. The others have a whole lot, the movies, game shows, sports, who's the father of the baby, all these things, and the viewership for those dwarfs that for news. Right. So you have a very small segment of the American population that's even seeing a news program. That's heavily filtered, okay? And then what's left and gets eased through the internet to only a segment of the population is such a big threat to American security that they have to fund up everything that they can lay their hands on.
Let me go back to James. Is it really such a threat? I mean, that's what I'm dumbfounded by. Is it really such a threat?
Yeah, I think that,
or is it they're just so used to having a monopoly, it angers them that anyone that challenges it. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like the neoconservatives can't really make up their mind whether or not RT is a civilizational threat, as Pomerantsev has repeatedly claimed, or as Victoria Nuland claimed at a Brookings Institution event not too long ago. She said, quote, RT has a tiny, tiny audience. So they seem confused on that front. But I would go back to what Mark was saying before. I think it's about the money. I mean, there's an ideological component, sure, but when you look at it, you know, this has become something of a cottage industry in Washington. I mean, you know, Ed Lucas has just issued his own report on Russian propaganda. These things are funded by, these think tanks that produce these reports are funded by the State Department and the Defense Department. And so, you know, hats off to them in a way. I mean, you know, it's America and everyone, you know, wants to make a living, and they have a right to do that. But I think it's a deeply, deeply cynical enterprise.
Okay, Mark, you know, propaganda is what somebody else does. It's not what you do, right?
Yeah, we have counter accusations of propaganda on both sides. But I want to speak to what RT's formula for success, particularly on the internet, as Don mentioned, is. They do much better with the current mediums what stations like RFE, RL, BBC World Service used to do well in the 70s and 80s. That is, RT gives a platform to what are minority voices of opposition in the United States and other Western countries that would not be given a platform otherwise, because their views are outside the views of the mainstream political parties and media outlets, which reinforce primarily, of course, the country's foreign policy interests abroad. And figures like myself or Peter or Don or James, which are in have a critical voice, are not allowed a platform. Now, this is the exact same formula that was applied to the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s very well. We see it continue with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, giving a voice to often, frankly, mental, extreme minority figures such as Masha Geshen in Russia, and elevating them through Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty right onto the pages of the New York Times, where the United States, the people of the United States listen to these people and think that they are any kind of representation of the Russian people. And we have to assume that this is done to all other countries as well. And it's a huge disservice not only to the American people, but also to the American politicians, the foreign policy class, that also get their information from these same sources. So it's a reinforcing circle of propaganda and ignorance, which has completely distorted American foreign policy.
You know, Don, what's really interesting to me is that in my focus, and a lot of this on this program, look at Russia, particularly Mark Slavelda here and myself, is that, you know, when I look at people commenting on Russia in Western media, the major outlets here, none of them, comes to my mind, are actually real Russia experts. And they're spin doctors. They spin propaganda, and what they counter propaganda that they claim is that we call news here. And the problem is that it's so much easier for someone like myself and yourself, James and Mark, is that if we just stick to the facts, we're pretty much in the comfort zone here. But they don't. They don't live in a fact-driven world. And that's why they get themselves so tongue-tied sometimes. Go ahead, Don.
Well, first of all, the mode of production is different. There are the wire services here that they rely on almost exclusively, and only some of them. They go into, basically, their input into a teleprompter, and the people that are on screen are not there because they're journalists, but because they deliver the news well, quote unquote, and they read the teleprompter without stuttering or contradicting themselves. That's kind of the you know, there's a difference in just the basic production design with American news and much of the rest of the world's news. So that's a part of it. But I have to take issue with the idea that there's not a very strong ideological component to it. And I won't belabor that point, but I'm going to use an example. There's the Pacifica Radio Network in the United States. It has 5 radio stations in major markets: New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Houston. It was a left-leaning, very strongly left-leaning radio network up through the late 1990s and early 2000s. There was a news producer named Amy Goodman who hosts a program now very popular called Democracy Now! When she was first starting, at the end, on Election Day, as a matter of fact, in the year 2000, Bill Clinton was calling around to radio shows, basically trying to plug Al Gore and get out the vote, and ended up on the phone with Amy Goodman, apparently without knowing who she was. And she put him on trial for his entire 8-year term over things from East Timor to Somalia to Yugoslavia and all of this. Gutted him. Well, what happened was there was a takeover of Pacifica that happened within a year by basically Democratic Party operatives. This was a nonprofit, it was membership corporation and all of that. And that lasted several years, and the network was again taken away right before, in 2009, right as Obama came into office, to protect the Democrats again from left criticism.
Okay,
so
John,
there are some
we're rapidly
forces,
running out of time here.
Easy to wrest it away.
Very good point here.
Forces.
We're rapidly running out of time. James here, if I could put into what Don just said into a nutshell here, one of the things that when I look at propaganda wars is the collapse of opposition in Western media markets, and I think that is really scary. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, well, what's also scary is that they have such an audience up on Capitol Hill. I cover a lot of the hearings up there, and it's absolutely ridiculous. You have people like Liz Wall, who has no discernible credentials for anything, up there testifying as an expert. And so this is where congressmen and women get their information. So it's absolutely frightening.
Okay, gentlemen, fascinating discussion. We've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington, New York, and here in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.